Hey, I just want to do a quick movie review on Exodus: Gods and Kings. I rented it recently on not Netflix, but the Redbox. Redbox with a you get the DVD, play it in a computer. I'd read a lot of criticism on the movie, and that's one of the reasons I hesitated to watch it. Being a Charleton Heston fan, I thought Charleton Heston did a good enough job of portraying Moses and in the Ten Commandments. And for my generation, that movie would replay every year around Passover time or Easter, depending on, usually about the same time, to tell the story of Moses and the freedom of the slaves from Egypt. The recent one was, of course, more controversial, and the one with Christian Bale. Now, I started to recognize a lot of the actors in the more recent one were a lot of Jewish actors in the background. The guy who played Ramses, I don't know. I mean, he played the part. I don't know why they would have such a distinctly white guy in that, and I think there was a little bit too much of an ode to political correctness on that. Because that was, I think they really didn't want to address certain racial elements to the demographics of what Egyptian society was at that time. And but most of the people would be portrayed as Middle Eastern. But I think scientifically and historically they were after a little bit more of the History Channel version of events with some scientific explanation. For example, there's some theories around on how God would interact with the environment here on Earth. Such as the seas or waters, turning to blood, or the animals going berserk, and in the River Nile, or this fly going berserk, a little fruit fly going berserk in front of my camera, or like the sequence of plagues, because one of the theories was that these things were a series of coincidences that we would say were acts of God. But there is certain types of because we used to call one of them red tide in Florida, certain microorganisms that could get into the water, and then of course the animals would react to that. There's certain things, but we would call it, in Florida we call it red tide, and when that stuff came in, it would kill fish. It would be like, if I was anywhere near the beach, it was like getting stung with tear gas. Like I always felt like something was in my eyes. Just from something that these things, this bloom of this stuff would emit. So the idea that something would make the animals go berserk or die or bleed out, or some kind of a plague happens, and then we had the frogs and the fleas and the flies or whatever, the series of plagues that were all as a result of that, it's scientifically possible. They also portrayed, for example, when the Red Sea parted or drained out or something like that. Don't forget, whenever we're dealing with stories that are being retold from ancient languages, we're dealing with translation issues. And how somebody cognitively pictures a translation issue is not necessarily biblical or non-biblical. It's a question of how they're doing that. For example, in later things, when the prophets are various prophets and soothsayers and seers are looking in the distant future, and they talk about the armies of heaven or Jesus or whatever, they say the sword that comes from his mouth is so powerful and loud. And then we realize that when we describe many types of guns and firearms, we're talking about a muzzle. Okay, we say it's a muzzle. This guy has a weapon that's very loud and bright, and it has a muzzle, and the sword, the injury is the piece of metal that flies out and does the damage. It comes out with bright flash, very loud, and so when somebody's, when an ancient person might ask, what is this thing you have? Well, it's my hand weapon. What does this do? Well, I have a knife, I have a sword, it does these things. And the guy says, well, mine comes out of the muzzle of this weapon, there's a flash, there's a noise, and it does damage, and here's what it is. Whether or not one of those prophets or seers is interacting with somebody, maybe they've been transported, or their consciousness has moved forward in time, so that the visions of these things could be revealed to them, you have to realize that when they go back to their own time and try to describe those things in their own language, even if it was translated for them, let's say what was divinely possible is that as our consciousness was transported forward in time, that God does something to make it where they can understand the language of everybody involved. It's one of the miracles, one of the things we recognize from Jesus' own sermons, is that when his sermons were witnessed by people of different nations, each of those people from those different nations heard the sermon in their own native language, because of the ability of Jesus to speak to people, that Jesus would be able to speak simultaneously in multiple languages. Divine power, being able to speak simultaneously to different people in their own native language. When we look at the exodus of gods and men, we would have issues with, okay, how does Moses speak the same language as the people in Canaan, and some of these issues? How did all of these people speak the same languages? Well, realizing that Egypt was a trade society at the time, there were certain common trade languages that people probably spoke. The parting the Red Sea is a point where they go to sleep on a beach, they think it's all hopeless. God's already sent the comet to drop the ocean down. Timing was important. Apparently God is manifesting in the body of this child who appears, but all of a sudden you start thinking, wait, this is a powerfully divine being who's interacting with them. And he says, listen, these things are already on the way. That explains some of the ways God would interact with the world on a macro basis, not necessarily micromanaging every event that takes place in the world. And that also in Exodus of Gods and Men, the portrayal of God through the body of a child is not a portrayal of Jesus, but a portrayal of God in youth. Don't forget, God would exist in a different type of a time-space continuum. So God in youth, at the time of Moses, which we would assume was about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, God in youth would have been portraying himself. Don't forget, if the movie producers prayed a lot and said, God, how would we portray you in this? Are you the wise old man in this? Are you going to be the pillar of fire? That sort of a thing. And that's where some liberties were taken, because we're not necessarily seeing the burning bush. We're seeing a burning bush, and then the child comes up and talks. And that's where there might be some biblical criticism on there, some criticism of faith. But the idea that the movie makers are trying to get across is that this was God at a point of maybe less maturity than now. That as humanity has progressed through the last few thousand years, that God has also progressed a bit through the last few thousand years. And that God may change the way he looks at humanity. That God may have matured in many different ways and may look at humanity differently. From not just from the fact that humanity is different, but God may be different. God may have matured more over the last several thousand years and had the experience of interacting with people. The other thing is, of course, if God were to come to earth in the flesh in some way, being born into being able to manipulate DNA and being able to inhabit a body, you would expect that somebody with massive amounts of divine intelligence at childhood level would be much more conscious than an adult, would not need to grow to adulthood before they could go out and survive on their own. And that's the other aspect of it. If God wanted to go and sneak around and interact with the world, interacting as a child, why wait to grow older? Why wait? If you've got a very, very intelligent child who's capable of interacting in an environment and has knowledge of everything, we would look at something where if a modern 12-year-old were to go into any environment, having full knowledge of the language, customs, and courtesies, full knowledge of what anything survival related, anything related to what plants and animals are edible, what values are there, how any kind of trade would work, have full access to all that knowledge, it would be able to go in and very quickly interact and be able to function at a survival level and demonstrate. If a wise old man went talking to Moses, he'd say, okay, he's a wise old guy, he knows something. if a child goes and starts telling me all this obviously really wise stuff, you can say, whoa, where's this coming from? Okay, something's up here. That would also explain the concept of Jesus going and teaching in the Hebrew temples at a very young age, and why tremendous amounts of information from the lifetime of Jesus is not told to us. It's not recorded. And that's one of the things, as a believer in Jesus, as a Christian, even though I have a varied background of mostly North European, but also some Jewish background, we're always asking a constant question. You know, we only have a small amount of information about Jesus' sermons, you know, and a lot of it was told after the fact. A few hundred years, or I think, you know, quite a while later, somebody says, okay, do we remember what he said? Do we remember what this other guy said that he said? That sort of a thing. One of the reasons why Muhammad had scribes following around telling him to write everything down. You know, write this down, write that down, write this down. Now, okay, God told me that, write it down. And that's because so much of Jesus' sermons and teachings, either somebody heard it and kept it secret, which then gives us the problem of, okay, when somebody comes up with that information considerably time later, a long time later, somebody comes up with this and says, here's what Jesus said, or here's what he really said. Well, how do we verify that? Because then we don't really know. As people dig up the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of what they're finding out, they want to hide. Okay, most of what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they want to hide. So, in disputing the authenticity of what's in the Exodus, Gods and Men, I don't know. I think it's a movie that's worth watching, but also realize it was produced by human beings. There's going to be certain shortcomings. The question of whether or not a slave rebellion was happening in Egypt at that time, and whether or not it was terroristic in nature, I think goes to human nature, and it goes to how conflicts work in the biblical era. And in that respect, it is a more mature look at the story of Exodus and Gods and Men. It's a more mature look at it, and I believe it's more for a more mature audience than perhaps the Charleton Heston version was made for. The Charleton Heston production was also much better looking. Okay, it was Technicolor. It was at a time of big Hollywood. Everybody in there was good looking. The movie was good looking. There's bright, vibrant colors in it. Exodus, Gods and Men is a little bit dirty and gritty, and that's one of the reasons I don't like it. They had some special effects in there, but there's several elements of the movie that are dirty and gritty. I understand it was a dirty and gritty time in ancient times. The people knew how to bathe. They knew what water was. They knew what soap was. I don't think we should have portrayed everybody there quite as dirty and gritty as the movie was done. It's also one of the criticisms I have of several of the more recent Christ movies. One of the things that happened at the time of the crucifixion is Jesus was well dressed for his day. He was so well dressed that when they were casting lots for who got to loot the clothes off of his corpse, they all said, let's not even tear up these clothes. These clothes are really nice. Let's gamble over what this guy's clothes are going to, who gets his clothes, because we don't want to tear this jacket. It's such a nice jacket, or a nice cloak, or whatever this was that he was wearing. In that aspect, we would also assume Jesus was probably a fairly good-looking guy. Don't forget that Mary Magdalene would come to him and throw herself at his feet, and she was a very sought-after woman. She was some kind of high-level prostitute, priestess type of person who was renowned as a super hooker or super temple prostitute of some sort. She's so enamored with Jesus, she throws herself at his feet, considering him the perfect man. So, for Jesus to have been a good-looking, well-dressed man, I think is a more correct portrayal, rather than the dirtiness that we see in some of these older films. And that's one of the criticisms I had of Gods of Men. I think the people were portrayed in a little bit more dirty, rough mode than really was there. And I see how they were trying to not do a remake of the Charleton Heston Ten Commandments, but I don't quite think they quite got it. They took away a little bit too much of the magic, and it's one of my criticisms of the film. Christian Bale has done sci-fi. He understands some aspects of how magic and sci-fi would be portrayed, and I don't think they were doing enough of it in the film Gods and Men. So anyway, that's part of my review. If you want to discuss it from our standpoint, we could. You'll see that in the comments below.